like a stripper, keeping its glory well covered by cloud till it seemed there'd be no show at all, then casting off its rags one by one. As the light grew, so did Boone's discomfort. Rummaging in the glove compartment, Laurie rooted out a pair of sunglasses, which Boone put on to keep the worst of the light from his sensitized eyes. Even then, he had to keep his head down, his face averted from the brightening east. They spoke scarcely at all. Laurie was too concerned to keep her weary mind on the task of driving, and Boone made no attempt to break the silence. He had thoughts of his own, but none that he could have articulated to the woman at his side. In the past, Laurie had meant a great deal to him, he knew, but making contact with those feelings now was beyond him. He felt utterly removed from his life with her, indeed, from life at all. Through the years of his sickness, he clung always to the threads of consequence he saw in living, how one action resulted in another, this feeling in that. He'd got through, albeit with stumbling steps, by seeing how the path behind him became the one ahead. Now he could see neither forward nor backward, except dimly. Clearest in his head, Baphomet, the divided one. Of all Midian's occupants, it was the most powerful and the most vulnerable, taken apart by ancient enemies, but preserved, suffering and suffering, in the flame Lylesburg had called the trial fire. Boone had gone into Baphomet's pit, hoping to argue his case, but it was the baptizer that had spoken oracles from a severed head. He could not now remember its pronouncements, but he knew the news had been real. Among his memories of the whole...
Hey, Migs, how you doing, bro?
...was that of Decker.
Gotta be on just a second.
Together several fragments of their shared history.
I was getting stuff situated in here real quick.
But he could not find it in himself to hate the man who'd led him to Midian's deeps, any more than he could love the woman who'd brought him out of them. They were part of some other biography, not quite his. What Laurie understood of his condition he didn't know, but he suspected she remained for the most part ignorant. Whatever she was, she seemed content to accept him as he was, and in a simple animal way, he needed her presence too much to risk telling her the truth, assuming that he could have found the words. He was as much and as little as he was. Man, monster, dead, alive. In Midian, he'd seen all these states in a single creature. They were, most likely, all true of him. The only people who might have helped him understand how such contraries could coexist were behind him, in the necropolis. They'd only begun the long, long process of educating him in Midian's history when he'd defied them. Now he was exiled from their presence forever, and he'd never know. There was a paradox. Lylesburg had warned him clearly enough as they'd stood together in the tunnels and listened to Laurie's cries for help. Told him unequivocally that if he broke cover, he broke his covenant with the breed. Remember what you are now, he'd said. You can't save her and keep our refuge, so you have to let her die. Yet he couldn't. Though Laurie belonged in another life, a life he'd lost forever, he couldn't leave her to the fiend. What that meant, if anything, was beyond his capacity to grasp right now. These few circling thoughts aside, he was sealed in the moment he was living, and the next moment, and the moment after that. Moving second by second through his life as the car moved over the road, ignorant of the place it had been, and blind to where it was headed. 2. They were almost within sight of the Sweet Grass Inn, when it occurred to Laurie that if Cheryl's body had been found at the Hudson Bay Sunset, there was a chance their destination would already be crawling with police. She stopped the car. "What's wrong?" Boone asked. She told him. "Perhaps it'd be safer if I went there alone," she said. "If it's safe, I'll get my things and come back for you." "No," he said. "That's not so good." She couldn't see his eyes behind the sunglasses, but his voice carried fear in it. "I'll be quick," she said. "No." "Why not?" "It's better we stay together." he replied. He put his hands over his face as he had at Midian's gates. Don't leave me alone, he said, his voice hushed. I don't know where I am, Lori. I don't even know who I am. Stay with me. She leaned over to him and kissed the back of his hand. He let go. She kissed his cheek and his mouth. They drove on together to the inn. In fact, her fears proved groundless. If Cheryl's body had indeed been located overnight, which was perhaps unlikely given its location, no connection had been made with the inn. Indeed, not only were there no police to bar their way, there was little sign of life at all. Only a dog yapping in one of the upper rooms and a baby crying somewhere. Even the lobby was deserted, the desk clerk too occupied with the morning show to keep his post. The sound of laughter and music followed them through the hall and up the stairs to the second floor. Despite the ease of it, by the time they'd reached the room, Laurie's hands were trembling so much she could scarcely align the key with the lock. She turned to Boone for assistance, only to discover that he was no longer close behind her, but lingering at the top of the stairs, looking back and forth along the corridor. Again she cursed the sunglasses, which prevented her reading his feelings with any certainty, at least until he backed against the wall, his fingers seeking some purchase, though there was none to be had. What's the problem, Boone? There's nobody here, he returned. Well, that's good for us, isn't it? I can smell. What can you smell? He shook his head. Tell me. I smell blood. Where from? He made no answer, nor did he look her way, but stared off down the corridor. I'll be quick, she told him. Just stay where you are, and I'll be back with you. Going down on her haunches, she clumsily fitted heaved, then stood up and opened the door. There was no scent of blood, only the stale perfume of the previous night. It reminded her instantly of Cheryl. Less than 24 hours ago, she'd been laughing in this very room and talking of her killer as the man of her dreams. Thinking of which, Laurie looked at him. He was still pressed against the wall, as if it were the only way to be certain the world wasn't toppling. Leading him to it, she stepped into the room and got about packing. First into the bathroom to collect her toiletries, and then back into the bedroom to gather her screws. It was only as she put her bag in the bed to pack it that she saw the crack in the wall. It was as if something had hit it from the other side very hard. The plaster had come away in clods and littered the floor between the twin beds. She stared at the crack a moment. Had the party got so riotous they started throwing the furniture around? Curious, she crossed to the wall. It was little more than a plasterboard partition, and the impact from the far side had actually opened a hole in it. She pulled a piece of loose plaster away and put her eye to the aperture. The curtains were still drawn beyond, but the sun was strong enough to penetrate, lending the air and odor. Last night's party must have been even more debauched than the one the night before, she thought. Wine stains on the walls and the celebrants still asleep on the floor. But the smell, it wasn't wine. She stepped back from the wall, her stomach turning. Fruit spilled no such juice. Another sip. Flesh, dear. And if it was blood she smelled, then it was blood she saw. And if it was blood she saw, then the sleepers were not sleeping. Because who lies down in an abattoir? Only the dead. She went quickly to the door. Down the corridor, Boone was no longer standing, but crouched against the wall, hugging his knees. His face, as he turned, was full of distressing sticks. Get up, she told him. It's not blood, he said softly. You're right. So get up, quickly, help me. But he was briefly rooted to the floor. She knew this posture of old, hunched in a corner, shivering like a beaten dog. In the past, she'd had comforting words to offer, but there was no time for such solace now. Perhaps someone had survived the bloodbath in the next room. If so, she had help with Boone or without. She turned the handle of the slaughterhouse door and opened it. As the smell of death came out to meet her, Boone started to moan. Blood, she heard him say. Everywhere, blood. She stood and stared for a full minute before forcing herself over the threshold to search for some sign of life. But even the most cursory glance at each of the corpses confirmed that the same nightmare had claimed all six. She knew his name, too. He'd left his mark, wiping their features out with his knives the way he had sheriffs. 3 of the men he'd caught in the Grande picture. 2 men and a woman, partially undressed and slumped over each other in the bed, their entanglements faded. Hand over her mouth to keep the smell out and the sobs in, she retreated from the room, the taste of her stomach in her throat. As she stepped out into the corridor, her peripheral vision caught sight of Boone. He wasn't sitting anymore, but moving purposefully down the passageway toward her. We have to get out, she said. He made no sign that he'd even heard her voice, but moved to the open door. Decker, she said. It was Decker. He still offered no reply. Talk to me, Boone.
Give me 1 second.
He would still be here.
It's okay, buddy.
We have to hurry. But he was already stepping inside into the car.
Oh,
She had no desire to go again. Instead, she
I
returned
know.
As she went about it, she heard Boone moving around the room next door, his breathing almost painful. Afraid of leaving him on his own for any time, she gave up on trying to collect all the most telling items, the photographs and an address book chief among them. And that done, went out into the corridor. The din of police silence was there to meet her, their panic fueling hers. Though the cars were still some way off, she
There we go.
couldn't doubt their destination. Louder with every whoop, they were coming to the sweet grass, hot for the guilty. She called for Boone. I'm finished, she said. Let's get going. There was no reply. Boone? She went to the door, trying to keep her eyes off the bodies. Boone was on the far side of the
Okay, let's put you back over here, buddy. Okay.
His breath was no longer audible.
There you go.
Do you hear me? She said. He didn't move a muscle. She could read no expression on his face. It was too dark. But she could see that he'd taken the sunglasses off. We haven't got much time, she said. Will you come on? As she spoke, he exhaled. It was no normal breath. She knew that even before the smoke started. As it came, he raised his hands to his mouth as if to stop it, but at his chin they halted and began to convulse. Get out, he said, on the same breath that brought the smoke. She couldn't move or even take her eyes off him. The murk was not so thick she couldn't see the change coming, his face reordering itself behind the veil, light burning in his eyes and climbing his neck in waves to melt the bones of his head. I don't want you to see, he begged her, his voice deteriorating. Too late. She'd seen the man with fire in his flesh at Midian, and the dog-headed painter, and more besides. Boone had all their diseases in his system, undoing his humanity before her eyes. He was the stuff of nightmares. No wonder he howled, head thrown back as his face was forfeited. The sound was almost canceled by the sirens, however. They could be no more than a minute from the door. If she went now, she might still outpace them. In front of her, Boone was done or undone entirely. He lowered his head. Remnants of smoke evaporated around him. Then he began to move, his new sinews bearing him lightly. Even now she hoped he understood his jeopardy and was coming to the door to be saved. But it was to the dead he moved, where the menage a trois still lay. And before she had the wit to look away, one of his clawed hands was reaching down and claiming a body from the heap, drawing it up toward his mouth. No, Boone, she shrieked. No! Her voice found him, or a part that was still Boone, lost in the chaos of this monster. He let the meat drop a little and looked up at her. His eyes were still blue, and they were full of tears. She started toward him. Don't, she begged. For an instant he seemed to weigh up love and appetite. Then he forgot her and lifted the human meat to his lips. She didn't watch his jaws close on it, but the sound reached her, and it was all she could do to stay conscious, hearing him tear and chew. From below, brakes screeching, doors slamming. In moments, they'd have the building surrounded, blocking any hope of escape. Moments later, they'd be coming up the stairs. She had no choice but to leave the beast to its hunger. Boone was lost to her. She elected not to return the way they'd come, but to take the back stairs. The decision was well made. Even as she turned the corner of the upper corridor, she heard the police at the other end, rapping on doors. Almost immediately afterward, she heard the sound of forced entry from above and exclamations of disgust. This couldn't be on finding Boone. He wasn't behind a locked door. Clearly, they discovered something in the upper corridor. She didn't need to hear the morning news to know what. Her instinct told her how thorough Decker had been the night before. There was a dog alive somewhere in the building, and he'd overlooked a baby in his heap. But the rest he'd taken. He'd come straight back from his failure at Midian and killed every living soul in the place. Above and below, the investigating officers were discovering that very fact, and the shock of it made them incompetent. Laurie had no difficulty slipping out of the building and away into the scrub at the back. Only as she reached the cover of the trees did one of the cops appear around the corner of the building, but even he had business other than the search. Once out of sight of his colleagues, he threw up his breakfast in the dirt, then scrupulously wiped his mouth with his handkerchief and went back to the job at hand. Secure that they wouldn't start a search of the exterior until they'd finished inside, she waited. What would they do to Boone when they found him? Shoot him down, most likely. There was nothing she could think of to prevent it. But the minutes passed, and though there were shouts from within, there was no sound of gunfire. They must have found him by now. Maybe she'd get a better grasp of what had happened from the front of the building. The inn was shielded on three sides by shrubbery and trees. It wasn't difficult to make her way through the undergrowth to the flank, her movement countered by an influx of rifle-bearing cops from the front to take up stations at the rear exit. Two more patrol cars were arriving at the scene. The first contained further armed troopers, the second a selection of interested parties. Two ambulance vans followed. They'll need more, she thought grimly. A lot more. Though the congregation of so many cars and armed men had attracted an audience of passers-by, the scene at the front was subdued, even casual. There were as many men standing and staring at the building as moving to enter and explore it. They grasped the point now. The place was a two-story coffin. More people had been murdered here in one night than had died by violence in sheer neck over its entire existence. Anyone here this bright morning was part of history. The knowledge hushed them. Her attention went from the witnesses to a knot of people standing around the lead car. A break in the circle of debaters allowed her a glimpse of the man at its center. Sober-suited, polished spectacles glinting in the sun, Decker held court. What was he arguing for? A chance to coax his patient out into the open air? If that was his pitch, he was being overruled by the only member of the circle in uniform. Sheerneck's police chief, presumably, who dismissed the wave of the hand, then stepped out of the argument. From a distance, it was impossible to read Decker's response. He was perfectly in control of himself, leaning to speak into the ear of one of the others, who nodded sagely at the whispered remark. Last night, Laurie had seen Decker the madman unmasked. Now she wanted to unmask him again, strip away this facade of civilized concern. But how? If she stepped out of hiding and challenged him, tried to begin to explain all that she'd seen in the last 24 hours, they'd be measuring her up for a straight before she'd taken a second breath. He was the one in the well-cut suit, with a doctorate and the friends in high places. He was the man, the voice of reason and analysis, while she, Mere woman. What credentials did she have? Lover of a lunatic and a sometime beast? Decker's midnight face was quite secure. Interruption of shouts from inside the building. On an order from their chief, the troopers outside leveled their weapons. The rest retired a few yards. Two cops, pistols aimed at someone inside, backed out of the door. A beat later, Boone, his hands cuffed in front of him, was pushed into the light. It nearly blinded him. He tried to turn from its brilliance back into the shadows, but there were two armed men following who pressed him forward. There was no sign remaining of the creature Laurie had seen him become, but there was ample reminder of his hunger. Blood glued his t-shirt to his chest and spattered his face and arms. There was some applause from the audience, uniformed and otherwise, at the sight of the killer chain. Decker joined it, nodding and smiling as Boone was led away, head averted from the sun, and put into the back of one of the cars. Laurie watched the scene with so many feelings grappling for her attention. Relief that Boone had not been shot on sight mingled with horror at what she now knew he was. Rage at Decker's performance and disgust at those who were taken in by it. So many masks. Was she the only one who had no secret life, no other self of marrow or mind? If not, then perhaps she had no place in this game of appearances. Perhaps Boone and Decker were the true lovers here, swapping blows and faces, but necessary to each other. And she'd hug this man, demanded he embraced her, put her lips to his face. She could never do that again, knowing what lay in wait behind his lips, behind his eyes. She could never kiss the beast. So why did the thought make her heart hammer? Chapter 16. Now or Never. 1.
What are you telling me? That there's more of these people involved? Some kind of cult?
Decker drew breath to deliver his warning about Midian again. The troopers called their chief everything but his name behind his back. 5 minutes in his presence, and Decker knew why. 10, and he was plotting the man's dismemberment. But not today. Today he needed Erwin Eigerman, and Eigerman, did he but know it, needed him. While daylight lasted, Midian was vulnerable, but they had to be swift. It was already 1 o'clock. Nightfall might still be a good distance away, but so was Midian. To get a task force out there to uproot the place was the work of several hours, and every minute lost to argument was a minute lost to action. Beneath the cemetery, Decker said, beginning again at the place he'd begun half an hour before. Eigerman scarcely made a pretense of listening. His euphoria had increased in direct proportion to the number of bodies brought out of the Sweetgrass Inn, a count that presently stood at 16. He had hopes for more. The only human survivor was a year-old baby found in a tumble of blood-soaked sheets. He'd taken her out of the building himself for the benefit of the cameras. Tomorrow the country would know his name. None of this would have been possible without Decker's tip-off, of course, which was why he was humoring the man. Though at this stage in proceedings, with interviewers and flashbulbs calling, he was damned if he was going to go after a few freaks who liked corpses for company, which was what Decker was suggesting he do. He took out his comb and began to rake over his thinning crop in the hope of fooling the cameras. He was no beauty, he knew. Should it ever slip his mind, he had Annie to remind him. You look like a sow, she was fond of remarking, usually before bedtime on a Saturday night. But then people saw what they wanted to see. After today, he'd look like a hero. Are you listening? Decker said.
I hear you. There's folks grave robbing.
I hear you. Not grave robbing, not folks. Freaks, Eigerman said.
I seen them.
Not the likes of these.
You're not saying any of them were at the Sweetgrass, are you?
No.
We've got the man responsible right here?
Yes.
Under lock and key?
Yes. But there are others in Midian.
Murderers? Probably.
You're not sure? Just get some of your people out there.
What's the hurry?
If I told you once, I told you a dozen times.
So, tell me again.
They have to be rounded up by daylight.
What are they? Some kind of bloodsuckers?
He chuckled to himself.
That what they are?
In a manner of speaking, Decker replied.
Well, in a manner of speaking, I gotta tell you, it's gonna have to wait. I got people want to interview me, Doctor. Can't leave them begging. It's not polite.
But polite. You've got deputies, haven't you? Or is this a one-cop town? Eigerman clearly bridled at this.
I've got deputies.
Then may I suggest you dispatch some of them to Midian?
To do what?
Dig around.
That's probably consecrated ground, mister,
Eigerman replied.
That's holy.
What's under it isn't, Decker replied with a gravity that had Eigerman silenced. You trusted me once, Irwin, he said, and you caught a killer. Trust me again. You have to turn Midian upside down. 2. There had been terrors, yes, but the old imperatives remained the same. The body had to eat, had to sleep. After leaving the Sweetgrass Inn, Laurie satisfied the first of these, wandering the streets until she found a suitably anonymous and busy store, then buying a collection of instant gratification foods. Donuts, custard-filled, and Dutch apple, chocolate milk, cheese. Then she sat in the sun and ate, her numbed mind unable to think much beyond the simple business of biting, chewing, and swallowing. The food made her so sleepy she couldn't have prevented her lids falling if she'd tried. When she woke, her side of the street, which had been bathed in sunshine, was in shadow. The stone step was chilly and her body ached. But the food and the rest, however primitive, had done her some good. Her thought processes were a little more in order. She had little cause for optimism, that was certain, but the situation had been bleaker when she'd first come through this town, on her way to find the spot where Boone had fallen. Then she'd believed the man she loved was dead. It had been a widow's pilgrimage. Now, at least, he was alive, though God alone knew what horror, contracted in the tombs of Midian, possessed him. Given that fact, it was perhaps good that he was safe in the hands of the law, the slow process of which would give her time to think through their problems. Most urgent of those, a way to unmask Decker. No one could kill so many without leaving some trace of evidence. Perhaps back at the restaurant where he'd murdered Cheryl. She doubted he'd lead the police there as he'd led them to the inn. It would seem too like complicity with the accused, knowing all the murder sites. He'd wait for the other corpse to be found by accident, knowing the crime would be ascribed to Boone, which meant, perhaps, the site was untouched, and she might still find some clue that would incriminate him, or, at the very least, open a crack in that controlled face of his. Returning to where Cheryl had died, and where she'd endured Decker's provocations, would be no picnic, but it was the only way to defeat she had. She went quickly. By daylight, she had a hope of getting up the courage to step through that burned-out door. By night, it would be another matter. 3. Decker watched as Eigerman briefed his deputies, poor men who shared with their chief the looks of bullies made good.
Now I trust our source,
He said magnanimously, throwing a look back at Decker.
and if he tells me something bad's going down in Midian, then I think that's worth listening to. I want you to dig around a little, see what you can see.
What exactly are we looking for? One of the number wanted to know. His name was Bettine, a 40-year-old with the wide, empty face of a comedian's foil, and a voice too loud and a belly too big.
Anything weird,
Eigerman told him. Like people been messing with the dead? The youngest of the four said.
Could be, Tommy,
Eigerman said. It's more than that, Decker put in. I believe Boone's got friends in the cemetery.
A fuckwit like that has friends,
Bettine said.
Sure as shit want to know what they look like. Well, you bring 'em back, boys. And if they won't come, what are you asking, Tommy? Who used force? Do unto others, boy, before they do unto you. They're good men, Eigerman told Decker when the quartet had been dispatched. If there's anything to find there, they'll find it. Good enough. I'm going to see the prisoner. You want to come? I've seen as much of Boone as I ever want to see. No problem, Eigerman said, and left Decker to his calculations. He'd almost elected to go with the troopers to Midian, but there was too much work to do here, preparing the ground for the revelations ahead. There would be revelations. Though so far Boone had declined to respond to even the simplest inquiries, he'd break his silence eventually. And when he did, Decker would have questions asked of him. There was no chance any of Boone's accusations could stick. The man had been found with human meat in his mouth, bloodied from head to foot. But there were elements of recent events that confounded even Decker, and until every variable had been pinned down and understood, he would fret. What, for instance, had happened to Boone? How had the scapegoat, filled with bullets and filed as dead, become the ravening monster he'd almost lost his life to the night before? Boone had even claimed he was dead, for Christ's sake, and in the chill of the moment, Decker had almost shared the psychosis. Now he saw more clearly. Eigerman was right. They were freaks, albeit stranger than the usual stuff. Things in defiance of nature, to be poked from under their stones and soaked in gasoline. He'd happily strike the match himself. Decker? He turned from his thoughts to find Eigerman closing the door on the babble of journalists outside. All trace of his former confidence had fled. He was sweating profusely. Okay, what the fuck's going on? Do we have a problem, Irwin? Shit alive, do we have a problem? Boone? Of course, Boone. What? The doctors have just looked him over. That's procedure. And? How many times did you shoot him? 3, 4? Yeah, maybe. Well, the bullets are still in him. I'm not that surprised, Dick said. I told you we're not dealing with ordinary people here. What did the doctor say? He should be dead? He is dead. When? I don't mean lying down dead, shithead, I mean sitting in my fucking cell dead. I mean his heart isn't beating. That's impossible. I've got 2 fuckers telling me the man is walking dead and inviting me to listen for myself. You want to tell me about that, doctor? Chapter 17. Delirium. Laurie stood across the street from the burned-out restaurant and watched it for 5 minutes to see if there was any sign of activity. There was none. Only now, in the full light of day, did she realize just how run down this neighborhood was. Decker had chosen well. The chance of anyone having seen him enter or leave the place the night before was most likely 0. Even in the middle of the afternoon, no pedestrian passed along the street in either direction, and the few vehicles that used the thoroughfare were speeding on their way to somewhere more promising. Something about the scene, perhaps the heat of the sun in contrast to Cheryl's unmarked grave, brought her solitary adventure in Midian back to it, or more particularly, her encounter with the girl. It wasn't just her mind's eye that conjured the girl. It seemed her whole body was reliving their first meeting. She could feel the weight of the beast she'd picked up from beneath the tree against her breast. Its labored breathing was in her ears. Its bitter sweetness pricked her nostrils. The sensations came with such force, they almost constituted a summoning, past jeopardy signaling present. She seemed to see the child looking up at her from her arms, though she'd never carried Babette in human form. The child's mouth was opening and closing, forming an appeal Laurie could not read from lips alone. Then, like a cinema screen blanked out in mid-movie, the images disappeared,
And she was left with one set of sensations: the street, the sun, the burned out building ahead. There was no purpose in putting off the evil moment any longer. She crossed the street, mounted the sidewalk, and, without allowing herself to slow her step by a beat, went through the carbonized doorframe into the murk beyond. So quickly dark, so quickly cold. One step out of the sunlight, and she was in another world. Her pace slowed a little now as she negotiated the maze of debris that lay between the front door and the kitchen. Fixed clearly in her mind was her sole intention: to turn up some shred of evidence that would convict Decker. She had to keep all other thoughts at bay: revulsion, grief, fear. She had to be cool and calm, play Decker's game. Girding herself, she stepped through the archway. Not into the kitchen, however, into Midian. She knew the moment it happened where she was. The chill and the dark of the tombs was unmistakable. The kitchen had simply vanished, every tile. Across the chamber from her stood Rachel, looking up at the roof, distress on her face. For a moment she glanced at Laurie, registering no surprise at her presence. Then she returned to watching and listening. "What's wrong?" Laurie said. "Hush," Rachel said sharply, then seemed to regret her harshness and opened her arms. "Come to me, child," she said. Child. So that was it. She wasn't in Midian. She was in Babette, seeing with the child's eyes. The memories she'd felt so strongly on the street had been a prelude to a union of minds. "Is this real?" she said. "Real," Rachel whispered. "Of course it's real." Her words faltered, and she looked at her daughter with inquiry on her face. "Babette," she said. "No," Laurie replied. "Babette, what have you done?" She moved toward the child, who backed away from her. Her view through these stolen eyes brought a taste of the past back. Rachel seemed impossibly tall, her approach ungainly. "What have you done?" she asked a second time. "I brought her," the girl said, "to see." Rachel's face became furious. She snatched at her daughter's arm, but the child was too quick for her. Before she could be caught, she'd scooted away, out of Rachel's reach. Laurie's mind's eye went with her, dizzied by the ride. "Come back here," Rachel whispered. Babette ignored the instructions and took to the tunnels, ducking around corner after corner with the ease of one who knew the labyrinth back to front. The route took runner and passenger off the main thoroughfares and into darker, narrower passages, until Babette was certain she was not being pursued. They had come to an opening in the wall, too small to allow adult passage. Babette clambered through, into a space no larger than a refrigerator, and as cold. This was the child's hideaway. Here she sat to draw breath, her sensitive eyes able to pierce the total darkness. Her few treasures were gathered around her. A doll made of grasses and crowned with spring flowers, 2 birds' skulls, a small collection of stones. For all her otherness, Babette was in this like any child, sensitive, ritualistic. Here was her world. That she'd let Laurie see it was no small compliment. But she hadn't brought Laurie here simply to see her hoard. There were voices overhead, close enough to be heard clearly. "Woo-wee! Will you look at this shit? You could hide a fucking army here." "Don't say it, Cass." "Shit in your pants, Tommy?" "Nope. Sure smells like it." "Fuck you." "Shut up, the both of you. We got work to do." "Where do we start?" "We look for any signs of disturbance." "There's people here. I feel them. Decker was right." "So let's get the fuckers out where we can see them." "You mean go down?" "I ain't going down." "No need." "So how the fuck do we bring them up, asshole?" The reply wasn't a word, but a shot, ringing off stone. "Be like shooting fish in a barrel," somebody said. "They won't come up. They can stay down there permanent."
Saves digging a grave. Who are these people? Lori thought. No sooner had she asked the question than Babette was up and clambering into a narrow duct that led off her playroom. It was barely large enough to accommodate her small body. A twinge of claustrophobia touched Lori. But there was compensation. Daylight up ahead, and the fragrance of the open air, which, warming Babette's skin, warmed Lori too. The passage was apparently some kind of drainage system. The child squirmed through an accumulation of debris, pausing only to turn over the corpse of a shrew that had died in the dust. The voices from overground were distressingly close. I say we just start here and open up every damn tomb till we find something to take home. Nothing here I want to take home. Shit, Bettine. I want prisoners, as many of the fuckers as we can get. Shouldn't we call in first? A fourth speaker now asked. This dissenting voice had not so far been heard in the exchanges. Maybe the chief's got fresh instructions for us. Fuck the chief, Bettine said. Only if he says please, came the response from Cass. Amid the laughter that followed, there were several other remarks exchanged, obscenities mostly. It was Bettine who silenced the hilarity. Okay, let's get the fuck on with it. Sooner the better, said Cass. Ready, Tommy? I'm always ready. The source of the light Babette was crawling toward now became apparent. A latticed grill in the side of the tunnel. Keep out of the sun, Lori found herself thinking. It's all right, Babette's thoughts replied. Clearly, this wasn't the first time she'd used the spy hole. The grill offered a view of the avenues, but was so placed in the mausoleum wall that direct sunlight did not fall through it. Babette put her face close to the grill to get a clearer grasp of the scene outside. Lori could see 3 of the 4 speakers. All were in uniform. All, despite their brave talk, looked like men who could think of a dozen better places to be than this. Even in broad daylight, armed to the teeth and safe in the sun, they were ill at ease. It wasn't difficult to guess why. Had they come to take prisoners from a tenement block, there'd be none of the half-glances and nervous tics on display here. But this was death's territory, and they felt like trespassers. In any other circumstances, she would have taken some delight in their discomfiture, but not here, not now. She knew what men afraid, and afraid of their fear, were capable of. They'll find us, she heard Babette think. Let's hope not, her thoughts replied. But they will, the child said. The prophetic says so. Who? Babette's answer was an image of a creature Lori had glimpsed when she'd gone in pursuit of Boone in the tunnels. The beast with larval wounds, lying on a mattress in an empty cell. Now she glimpsed it in different circumstances, lifted up above the heads of a congregation by 2 freed, down whose sweating arms the creature's burning blood coursed. It was speaking, though she couldn't hear its words. Prophecies, she presumed, and among them this scene. They'll find us and try to kill us all, the child thought. And will they? The child was silent. Will they, Babette? The prophetic can't see, because it's one of those who'll die. Maybe I'll die too. The thought had no voice, so came as pure feeling. A wave of sadness that Lori had no way to resist or heal. One of the men, Lori now noticed, had sidled toward his colleague and was surreptitiously pointing at a tomb to their right. Its door stood slightly ajar. There was movement within. Lori could see what was coming. So could the child. She felt a shudder run down Babette's spine, felt her fingers curl around the lattice, gripping it in anticipation of the horror ahead. Suddenly the 2 men were at the tomb door and kicking it wide. There was a cry from within. Somebody fell. The lead cop was inside in seconds, followed by his partner, the din alerting the 3rd and 4th to the tomb door. Out of the way, the cop inside yelled. The trooper stepped back, and with a grin of satisfaction on his face, the arresting officer dragged his prisoner out of hiding, his colleague kicking from behind. Laurie caught only a glimpse of their victim, but quick-eyed Babette named him with a thought. Onaka. On your knees, asshole, the cop bringing up the rear demanded, and kicked the legs from under the prisoner. The man went down, bowing his head to keep the sun from breaching the defense of his wide-brimmed hat. Good work, Gibbs, the teen grinned. So where's the rest of them? The youngest of the four, a skinny kid with a coxcomb, demanded. Underground, Tommy, the fourth man announced. That's what Iverman said. Gibbs closed in on Onaka. We'll get fuckface to show us, he said. He looked up at Tommy's companion, a short, wide man. You're good with the questions, Cass. Ain't nobody ever said no to me, the man replied. True or false? True.
Hey, big movie fan, how you
You
doing?
want this man on your case? Petin asked Onaka. The prisoner said nothing. Don't think he heard.
I definitely appreciate it, big
You
movie
asked
fan.
Cass.
I hope you have a good rest of your
Ask him
evening.
hard. Cass approached Onaka, reaching down and snatching the brimmed hat from his head. Instantly, Onaka began to scream. Shut the fuck up, Cass yelled at him, kicking him in the belly. Onaka went on screaming, his arms crossed over his bald head to keep the sun off it as he clambered to his feet. Desperate for the succor of the dark, he started back toward the open door, but young Tommy was already there to block his way. Good man, Tommy, Petin hollered. Go get him, Cass. Forced back into the sun, Onaka had begun to shudder as though a fit had seized him.
I definitely appreciate it, a big movie
The
fan.
prisoner's arms no longer had the strength to protect his head. They fell to his sides, smoking, leaving Tommy to look straight into his face. The boy cop didn't speak. He just took 2 stumbling steps backward, dropping his rifle as he did so. What are you doing, dickhead? Petin yelled. Then he reached and took hold of Onaka's arm to prevent him claiming the dropped weapon. In the confusion of the moment, it was difficult for Laurie to see what happened next, but it seemed Onaka's flesh gave way. There was a cry of disgust from Cass and one of fury from Petin as he pulled his hand away, dropping a fistful of fabric and dust. What the fuck? Tommy shouted. What the fuck? What the fuck? Shut up, Gibbs told him, but the boy had lost control. Over and over the same question. What the fuck? Unmoved by Tommy's panic, Cass went in to beat Onaka back down to his knees. The blow he delivered did more than he intended. It broke Onaka's arm at the elbow, and the limb fell off at Tommy's feet. His shouts gave way to puking. Even Cass backed off, shaking his head in disbelief. Onaka was past the point of no return. His legs buckled beneath him, his body growing frailer and frailer beneath the assault of the sun. But it was his face turned now toward Petin that brought the loudest shouts. As the flesh dropped away and smoke rose from his eye sockets, as though his brain were on fire. He no longer howled. There was no strength in his body left for that. He simply sank to the ground, head thrown back as if to invite the sun's speed and have the agony over. Before he hit the paving, some final stitch in his being snapped with a sound like a shot. His decaying remains flew apart in a burst of blood, dust, and bones. Laurie willed Babette to look away, as much for her own sake as that of the child. But she refused to avert her eyes. Even when the horror was over, Onaka's body spread in pieces across the avenue. She still pressed her face to the grill, as if to know this death by sunlight in all its particulars. Nor could Laurie look away while the child stared on. She shared every quiver in Babette's limbs, tasted the tears she was holding back, so as not to let them cloud her vision. Onaka was dead, but his executioners were not finished with their business yet. While there was more to see, the child kept watching. Tommy was trying to wipe spattered puke from the front of his uniform. Petin was kicking over a fragment of Onaka's corpse. Cass was taking a cigarette from Gibbs's breast pocket. Give me a light, will you? He said. Gibbs dug his trembling hand into his trouser pocket for matches, his eyes fixed on the smoking remains. Never saw nothing like that before, Bettine said, almost casually. You shit yourself this time, Tommy? Gibbs said. Fuck you, came the reply. Tommy's fair skin was flushed red. Kaz said we should have called the chief, he said. He was right. What the fuck does Igerman know? Bettine commented and spat into the red dust at his feet. You see the face on that fucker? Tommy said. You see the way it looked at me? I was near dead, I tell you. He would have had me. What's going on here? Cass said. Gibbs had the answer almost right. Sunlight, he replied. I heard there's diseases like that. It was the sun got him. No way, man, said Cass. I never seen or heard of nothing like that. Well, we seen and heard it now, said Bettine with more than a little satisfaction. It weren't no hallucination. So what do we do? Gibbs wanted to know. He was having difficulty getting the match in his shaking fingers to the cigarette between his lips. We look for more, said Bettine, and we keep looking. I ain't, said Tommy. I'm calling the fucking chief. We don't know how many of these freaks there are. There could be hundreds. You said so yourself. Hide a fucking army, you said. What are you so scared of? Gibbs replied. You saw what the sun did to it. Yeah, and what happens when the sun goes down, fuckwit, was Tommy's retort. The match flame burned Gibbs' fingers. He dropped it with a curse. I seen the movies, Tommy said. Things come out at night. Judging by the look on Gibbs's face, he'd seen the same movies. Maybe you should call up some help, he said, just in case. Laurie's thoughts spoke hurriedly to the child. You must warn Rachel. Tell her what we've seen. They know already, came the child's reply. Tell them anyway. Forget me. Tell them, Babette, before it's too late. I don't want to leave you. I can't help you, Babette. I don't belong with you. She tried to prevent the thought coming, but it was too late. I'm normal. The sun won't kill me the way it'll kill you. I'm alive. I'm human. I don't belong with you. She had no opportunity to qualify this hurried response. Contact was broken instantly, the view from Babette's eyes disappearing, and Laurie found herself standing on the threshold of the kitchen. The sound of flies was loud in her head. Their buzzing was no echo of Midian, but the real thing. They were circling the room ahead of her. She knew all too well what scent had brought them here, egg-laden and hungry. And she knew with equal certainty that after all she'd seen in Midian, she couldn't bear to take another step toward the corpse on the floor. There was too much death in her world, inside her head and out. If she didn't escape it, she'd go mad. She had to get back into the open air where she could breathe freely. Maybe find some unremarkable shop about the weather, about the price of sanitary napkins. Anything, as long as it was banal, predictable. But the flies wanted to buzz in her ears. She tried to swat them away. Still, they came at her and at her, their wings buttered with death, their feet red with it. Let me alone, she sobbed. But her excitement drew them in larger and still larger numbers. They rose at the sound of her voice from their dining table behind the ovens. Her mind struggled to take hold of the reality she'd been thrown back into, her body to turn and leave the kitchen. Both mind and body failed. The cloud of flies came at her, their numbers now so large they were a darkness unto themselves. Dimly she realized that such a multiplicity was impossible, and that her mind, in its confusion, was creating this terror. But the thought was too far from her to keep the madness at bay. Her reason reached for it, and reached, but the cloud was upon her now. She felt their feet on her arms and face, leaving trails of whatever they'd been dabbling in. Cheryl's blood, Cheryl's bile, Cheryl's sweat and tears. There were so many of them, they could not all find flesh to occupy. So they began to force their way between her lips and crawl up her nostrils and across her eyes. Once, in a dream of Midian, hadn't the dead come as dust from all four corners of the world?
And hadn't she stood in the middle of the storm, caressed, eroded, and been happy to know that the dead were on the wind? Now came the companion dream, horror to the splendor of the first. A world of flies to match that world of dust. A world of incomprehension and blindness, of the dead without burial and without a wind to carry them away. Only flies to feast on them, to lie in them and make more flies. And matching dust against flies, she knew which she favored. Knew, as consciousness went out of her completely, that if Midian died, and she let it, if Peteen and Gibbs and their friends dug up the night breed's refuge, then she, dust herself one day, and touched by Midian's condition, would have nowhere to be carried, and would belong, body and soul, to the flies. Then she hit the tiles. Chapter 18. The Wrath of the Righteous. 1. For Eigerman, bright ideas and excretion were inextricably linked. He did all his best thinking with his trousers around his ankles. More than once in his cups, he'd explained to any who'd listen that world peace and a cure for cancer could be achieved overnight if the wise and good would just sit down and take a crap together. Sober, the thought of sharing that most private of functions would have appalled him. The can was a place for solitary endeavor, where those weighed down by high office could snatch a little time to sit and meditate upon their burdens. He studied the graffiti on the door in front of him. There was nothing new among the obscenities, which was reassuring. Just the same old itches needing to be scratched. It gave him courage in the face of his problems, which were essentially twofold. First, he had a dead man in custody. That, like the graffiti, was an old story. But zombies belonged in the late movie, as sodomy did on a lavatory wall. They had no place in the real world. Which brought him back to the second problem, the panicked call from Tommy Kahn, reporting that something bad was going down in Midian. To those two, on reflection, he now added a third, Decker. He wore a fine suit and he talked fine talk, but there was something unwholesome about him. Eigerman hadn't admitted the suspicion to himself until now, sitting on the crapper, but it was plain as his dick once he thought about it. The bastard knew more than he was telling, not just about Dead Man Boone, but about Midian and whatever was going on there. If he was setting Sheerneck's finest up for a fall, then there'd come a reckoning time, sure as shit, and he'd regret it. Meanwhile, the chief had to make some decisions. He'd begun the day a hero, leading the arrest of the Calgary killer, but instinct told him events could very quickly get out of hand. There were so many imponderables in all of this, so many questions to which he had no answers. There was an easy way out, of course. He could call his superiors in Edmonton and pass the whole fuck up along to them to deal with. But if he gave away the problem, he also gave the glory. The alternative was to act now, before nightfall, Tommy had kept saying. And how far was that? 3-4 hours, to root out the abominations of Midian. If he succeeded, he'd double his helping of accolades. In one day, he'd not only have brought a human evil to justice, but scoured the cesspit in which it had found succor. An appealing notion. But again, the unanswered questions raised their heads, and they weren't pretty. If the doctors who'd examined Boone and reports coming out of Midian were to be trusted, then things he'd heard only in stories were true today. Did he really want to pit his wits against dead men who walked and beasts that sunlight killed? He sat, cracked, and weighed up the alternatives. It took him half an hour, but he finally came to a decision. As usual, once the sweat was over, it looked very simple. Perhaps today the world was not quite the way it had been yesterday. Tomorrow, God willing, it would be its old self. Dead men dead, and sodomy on the walls where it belonged. If he didn't seize his chance to become a man of destiny, there wouldn't be another. At least not till he was too old to do more than tend his hemorrhoids. This was a God-given opportunity to show his mettle. He couldn't afford to ignore it. With new conviction in his gut, he wiped his ass, hauled up his pants, flushed the crapper, and went out to meet the challenge head on. 2.
I want volunteers, Cormac, who'll come out to Midian with me and get digging.
How soon do you need them?
Now, we don't have much time. Start with the bars. Take Holiday with you.
What are we telling them it's for? Eigerman mused on this for a moment. What to tell?
Say we're looking for grave robbers. That'll get a sizable turnout. Anyone with a gun and a shovel's eligible. I want them mustered in an hour. Less if you can do it.
Decker smiled as Cormac went on his way.
You happy now?
Eigerman said. I'm pleased to see you've taken my advice.
Your advice shit.
Decker just smiled.
Get the fuck out of here,
Eigerman said.
I've got work to do. Come back when you found yourself a gun.
I just might do that. Eigerman watched him leave, then picked up the phone. There was a number he'd been thinking about dialing since he'd made up his mind to go into Midian. A number he hadn't had reason to call in a long time. He dialed it now. In seconds, Father Ashbury was on the line.
You sound breathless, Father.
Ashbury knew who his caller was without need of prompting.
Eigerman. Got it in one. What have you been up to?
I've been out running.
Good idea. Sweat out the dirty thoughts.
What do you want?
What do you think I want? A priest.
I've done nothing.
That's not what I hear.
I'm not paying, Eigerman. God forgave me my sins.
Not in question.
So leave me alone.
Don't hang up.
Ashbury was quick to detect the sudden anxiety in Eigerman's voice. Well, well, he said.
What?
You've got a problem.
Maybe both of us do.
Meaning?
I want you here real quick, with whatever you've got in the way of crucifixes and holy water.
What for?
Trust me.
Ashbury laughed. I'm not at your beck and call any longer, Eigerman. I've got a flock to tend.
So do it for them.
What are you talking about?
You preach the day of judgment, right? Well, they're warming up for it over in Midian.
Who are?
I don't know who and I don't know why. All I know is we need a little holiness on our side, and you're the only priest I've got. You're on your own, Eigerman. I don't think you're listening. I'm talking serious shit here.
I'm not playing any of your damn fool games.
I mean it, Ashbury. If you don't come of your own accord, I'll make you.
I burned the negative, Eigerman. I'm a free man. I kept copies. There was silence from the father. Then, you swore. I lied. You're a bastard, Eigerman.
And you wear lacy underwear. So how soon can you be here?
Silence.
Ashbury, I asked the question.
Give me an hour.
You've got 45 minutes.
Fuck you.
That's what I like. A God-fearing lady.
3. Must be the hot weather, Eigerman thought, when he saw how many men Cormac and Holiday had rounded up in the space of 60 minutes. Hot weather always got folks itchy, for fornication maybe, for killing. And Sheerneck being what it was, and fornication not being so easy to get just whenever you wanted. The hunger to do some shooting was well up today. There were 20 men gathered outside in the sun, and 3 or 4 women coming along for the ride, plus Ashbury and his holy water. There had been 2 more calls from Midian in that hour, one from Tommy, who was ordered back into the cemetery to help the team contain the enemy until reinforcements arrived. The second from Petin himself, informing Eigerman that there'd been an escape made by one of Midian's occupants. He'd slipped away through the main gate while accomplices created a diversion. The nature of this diversion not only explained Petin's choking as he delivered his report, but also why they'd failed to give chase. Somebody had ignited the tires of the cars. The conflagration was quickly consuming the vehicles, including the radio upon which the report was being made. Petin was in the process of explaining that there would be no further bulletins when the airwaves went dead.
Igerman kept this information to himself for fear it cooled anyone's appetite for the adventure ahead. Killing was all fine, but he wasn't so sure there'd be quite so many ready to roll now if it was common knowledge that some of the bastards were ready to fight back. As the convoy moved off, he looked at his watch. They had maybe 2.5 hours of good light left before dusk began to settle in. 3/4 of an hour to Midian, which left an hour and 3/4 to get these fuckers dealt with before the enemy had night on its side. That was long enough if they were organized about it. Best to treat it like a regular shakedown, Igerman supposed. Drive the bastards out into the light and see what happened. If they came apart at the seams, the way Piss Pants Tommy had kept saying, then that was all the proof a judge would need that these creatures were unholy as hell. If not, if Decker was lying, Patine on dope again, and all this a fool's errand, he'd find someone to shoot so it wasn't all a wasted journey. Might just turn around and put a bullet through the zombie in cell 5, the man with no pulse and blood on his face. Either way, he wouldn't let the day end without tears. Part 5. The Good Night. No sword shall touch you unless it be mine. Anonymous. Lover's Oath. Chapter 19. A Friendless Face. 1. Why did she have to wait? Why did there have to be a coming to? Couldn't she just sink and sink further into the nowhere she'd taken refuge in? But it didn't want her. She rose from it unwillingly and into the old pain of living and dying. The flies had gone. That at least was something. She got to her feet, her body cumbersome, an embarrassment. As she made an attempt to dust the dirt from her clothes, she heard the voice calling her name. For a ghastly moment, she thought the voice was Cheryl's, that the flies had succeeded in their ambition and driven her to lunacy. But when it came a second time, she put another name to it, Babette. The child was calling her. Turning her back on the kitchen, she picked up her bag and started through the debris toward the street. The light had changed since she'd made the first crossing. Hours had passed while she debated with sleep. Her watch, broken in the fall, refused to tell how many. It was still balmy on the street, but the heat of noon had long passed. The afternoon was winding down. It could not be long until dusk. She began to walk, not once looking back at the restaurant. Whatever crisis of reality had overcome her there, Babette's voice had called her from it, and she felt oddly buoyant, as though something about the way the world worked had come clear. She knew what it was without having to think too hard. Some vital part of her, heart or head or both, had made its peace with Midian and all it contained. Nothing in the chambers had been as agonizing as what she'd confronted in the burned-out building. The loneliness of Cheryl's body, the stench of creeping decay, the inevitability of it all. Against that, the monsters of Midian, transforming, rearranging ambassadors of tomorrow's flesh and reminders of yesterday's, seemed full of possibilities. Weren't there, among those creatures, faculties she envied? The power to fly, to be transformed, to know the condition of beasts, to defy death? All that she'd coveted or envied in others of her species now seemed valueless. Dreams of the perfected anatomy, the soap opera face, the centerfold body, had distracted her with promises of true happiness. Empty promises. Flesh could not keep its glamour, or eyes their sheen. They would go to nothing soon. But the monsters were forever, part of her forbidden self, the dark transforming millions. She longed to be numbered among them. There was still much she had to come to terms with, not least their appetite for human flesh, which she'd witnessed firsthand at the Sweetgrass Inn. But she could learn to understand. In a real sense, she had no choice. She'd been touched by a knowledge that had changed her inner landscape about all recognition.
There was no way back to the bland pastures of adolescence and early womanhood. She had to go forward. And tonight, that meant along this empty street, to see what the coming night had in store. The idling engine of a car on the opposite side of the road drew her attention. She glanced across at it. Its windows were all wound up, despite the warmth of the air, which struck her as odd. She could not see the driver. Both windows and windshield were too thick with grime. But an uncomfortable suspicion was growing in her. Clearly, the occupant was waiting for someone. And given that there was nobody else in the street, that someone was most likely her. If so, the driver could only be one man, for only one knew that she had a reason to be here. Decker. She started to run. The engine revved. She glanced behind her. The car was moving off from its parking place, slowly. He had no reason to hurry. There was no sign of life along the street. No doubt there was help to be had if only she knew which direction to run. But the car had already halved the distance between them. Though she knew she couldn't outrun it, she ran anyway, the engine louder and louder. She heard the tire walls squeal against the sidewalk. Then the car appeared at her side, keeping pace with her yard for yard. The door opened. She ran on. The car kept its companion pace, the door scraping the concrete. Then, from within, the invitation. Get in. Bastard, to be so calm. Get in, will you, before we're arrested. It wasn't Decker. The realization was not a slow burn, but a sudden comprehension. It wasn't Decker speaking from the car. She stopped running, her whole body heaving with the effort of catching her breath. The car also stopped. Get in, the driver said again. Whew, she tried to say, but her lungs were too jealous of her breath to provide the words. The answer came anyway. Friend of Boone's. Still, she hung back from the open door. Babette told me how to find you, the man went on. Babette? Will you get in? We've got work to do. She approached the door. As she did so, the man said, Don't scream. She didn't have the breath to make a sound, but she certainly had the inclination when her eyes fell on the face in the gloom. This was one of Midian's creatures, no doubt, but not a brother to the fabulous things she'd seen in the tunnels. The man's appearance was horrendous, his face raw and red, like uncooked liver. Had it been any other way, she might have distrusted it, knowing what she knew about pretenders. But this creature could pretend nothing. His wound was a vicious honesty. My name's Narcissus, he said. Will you shut the door, please? It keeps the light out. And the flies. 2. His story, or at least its essentials, took 2.5 blocks to tell. How he'd first met with Boone in the hospital, how he'd later gone to Midian and once more encountered Boone, how together they'd broken Midian's laws, trespassing over ground. He had a souvenir of that adventure, he told her, a wound in his belly, the like of which a lady should never have to set eyes upon. So they exiled you, like Boone? She said. They tried to, he told her, but I hung on there, hoping I could maybe get myself a pardon. Then when the troopers came, I thought, well, we brought this on the place. I should try and find Boone. Try and stop what we started. The sun doesn't kill you? Maybe I've not been dead long enough, but no, I can bear it. You know Boone's in prison? Yeah, I know. That's why I got the child to help me find him. I'm thinking together we can get him out. How in God's name do we do that? I don't know, Narcissus confessed. But we damn well better try and be quick about it. There are people out of Midian right now digging it up. Even if we can see Boone, I don't see what he can do. He went into the baptizer's chamber, Narcissus replied, his finger going to lip and heart. He spoke with bafflement. From what I hear, nobody other than Lylesburg ever did that before and survived. I'm figuring the baptizer had some tricks to pass on, something that'll help us stop the destruction. Laurie pictured Boone's terrified face as he stumbled from the chamber. I don't think Baphomet told him anything, Laurie said. He barely escaped alive.
Narcissus laughed. He escaped, didn't he? You think the baptizer would have allowed that if there hadn't been a reason for it? All right. So how do we get access to him? They'll have him guarded within an inch of his life. Narcissus smiled. What's so funny? You forget what he is now, Narcissus said. He's got powers. I don't forget, Lori replied. I simply don't know. He didn't tell you? No. He went to Midian because he thought he'd shed blood. I guess that much. He hadn't, of course. He was guiltless, which made him meat. You mean he was attacked? Almost killed. But he escaped, at least as far as the town. Where Decker was waiting for him, Lori said, finishing the story, or beginning it. He was damn lucky that none of the shots killed him. Narcissus' smile, which had more or less lingered on his face since Lori's remark about Boone being guarded within an inch of his life, disappeared. What do you mean, he said, none of the shots killed him? What do you think took him back to Midian? Why do you think they opened the tombs to him the second time? She stared at him blankly. I don't follow, she said, hoping she didn't. What are you telling me? He was bitten by Peliquin, Narcissus said. Bitten and infected. The balm got into his blood. He stopped speaking. You want me to go on? Yes. The balm got into his blood, gave him the powers, gave him hunger, and allowed him to get up off the slab and go walking. His words had grown soft by the end of his statement, in response to the shock on Lori's face. He's dead? She murmured. Narcissus nodded. I thought you understood that, he said. I thought you were making a joke before about his being. The remark trailed into silence. This is too much, Lori said. Her fist had closed on the door handle, but she lacked the strength to pull on it. Too much. Dead isn't bad, Narcissus said. It isn't even that different. It's just unexpected. Are you speaking from experience? Yes. Her hand dropped from the door. Every last ounce of strength had gone from her. Don't give up on me now, Narcissus said. Dead. All dead. In her arms, in her mind. Lori, speak to me. Say something. If it's only goodbye. How can you joke about it? She asked him. If it's not funny, what is it? Sad. Don't want to be sad. Smile, will you? We're going to save Loverboy, you and me. She didn't reply. Do I take silence as consent? Still, she made no answer. Then I do. Chapter 20. Driven. 1. Eigerman had been to Midian only once before, when providing backup for the cavalry force in their pursuit of Boone. It had been then that he'd met Decker, who'd been the hero of that day, risking his life to try and coax his patient out of hiding. He'd failed, of course. The whole thing had ended in Boone's summary execution as he stepped out into plain sight. If ever a man should have lain down and died, it was that man. Eigerman had never seen so many bullets in one lump of flesh. But Boone hadn't lain down. At least hadn't stayed down. He'd gone walkabout, with no heartbeat and flesh the color of raw fish. Sickening stuff. It made Eigerman's hide crawl to think of it. Not that he was about to admit that fact to anyone, not even to his passengers in the back seat, the priest and the doctor, both of whom had secrets of their own. Ashbury's he knew. The man liked to dress in women's dainties, which fact Eigerman had chanced upon and used as leverage when he'd needed sanctification of a sin or two of his own. But Decker's secrets remained a mystery. His face betrayed nothing, even to an eye as practiced in the recognition of guilt as Eigerman's. Re-angling the mirror, the chief looked at Ashbury, who shot him a sullen glance. Ever exercise anyone? He asked the priest. No. Never watch it done? Again. No. You do believe, Eigerman said. In what? In heaven and hell, for Christ's sake. Define your terms. Huh? What do you mean by heaven and hell? Jesus, I don't want to fucking debate. You're a priest, Ashbury. You're supposed to believe in the devil. Isn't that right, Decker? The doctor grunted. Eigerman pushed a little harder. Everyone's seen stuff they can't explain, haven't they? Especially doctors, right? You've had patients speaking in tongues? I can't say that I have, Decker replied. Is that right? It's all perfectly scientific, is it? I'd say so. You'd say so. And what would you say about Boone? Eigerman pressed. Is being a fucking zombie scientific too? I don't know, Decker murmured. Well, will you look at this? I've got a priest who doesn't believe in the devil and a doctor who doesn't know science from his asshole. That makes me feel real comfortable. Decker didn't respond. Ashbury did. You really think there's something up ahead, don't you? He said. You're sweating a flood. Don't push, sweetheart, Eigerman said. Just dig out your little book of exorcisms. I want those freaks sent back wherever the fuck they came from. You're supposed to know how. There are other explanations these days, Eigerman, Ashbury replied. This isn't Salem. We're not going to burning. Eigerman turned his attention back to Decker, floating his next question lightly. What do you think, Doc? Think maybe we should try putting the zombie on the couch? Ask him if he ever wanted to fuck his sister? Eigerman threw a look at Ashbury. Or dress in her underwear? I think we are going to Salem, Decker replied. There was an undercurrent in his voice Eigerman hadn't heard before. And I also think you don't give a fuck what I believe or don't believe. You are going to burn them out anyway. Right on, Eigerman said with a throaty laugh. And I think Ashbury's right. You're terrified. That silenced the laugh. Asshole, Eigerman said quietly. They drove the rest of the way in silence, Eigerman setting a new pace for the convoy, Decker watching the light getting frailer with every moment, and Ashbury, after a few minutes of introspection, leafing through his book of prayers, turning the onion-skinned pages at speed, looking for the rites of expulsion. 2. Petin was waiting for them, 50 yards from the necropolis gate, his face dirtied by smoke from the cars, which were still burning. What's the situation? Eigerman wanted to know. Well, there's been no sign of movement in there since the escape, but we've heard stuff. Like what? Like we're sitting on a termite hill, Petin said. There's things moving around underground, no doubt about that. You can feel it as much as hear it. Decker joined the debate, cutting Petin off in mid-flow to address Eigerman. We've got an hour and 20 minutes before the sun sets. I can count, Eigerman replied. So are we going to get digging? When I say so, Decker. Decker's right, Chief, Petin said. It's sun these bastards are afraid of. I tell you, I don't think we want to be here at nightfall. There's a lot of them down there. We'll be here as long as it takes to clear this shit up, said Eigerman. How many gates are there? 2. The big one and another on the northeast side. All right. So it shouldn't be difficult to contain them. Get one of the trucks in front of the main gate, and we'll post men at intervals around the wall just to make sure nobody gets out. Once they're sealed in, we make our approach. See, you brought some insurance, Petin commented, looking at Ashbury. Damn right. Eigerman turned to the priest. You can bless water, right? Make it holy? Yes. So do it. Any water we can find. Bless it, spread it among the men. It may do some good if bullets don't. And you, Decker, stay out of the fucking way. This is police business now. Orders given. Eigerman walked down toward the cemetery gates. Crossing the dusty ground, he rapidly understood what Petin had meant by a termite hill. There was something going on below ground. He even thought he heard voices, bringing visions of premature burial to mind. He'd seen that once, or its consequences. Done the spade work, disinterring a woman who'd been heard screaming underground. She'd had reason. She'd given birth and died in her coffin. The child, a freak, had survived. Ended up in an asylum, probably.
Or here, perhaps, in the earth with the rest of the motherfuckers. If so, he could count the minutes left of his sick life on his six-fingered hand. Soon as they showed their heads, Eigerman would kick them right back where they came from, bullets in their brain. So let them come. He wasn't afraid. Let them come. Let them try to dig their way out. His heel was waiting. 3. Decker watched the organization of the troops until it began to make him uneasy. Then he withdrew up the hill a little. He loathed being an observer of other men's labor. It made him feel impotent. It made him long to show them his power, and that was always a dangerous urge. The only eyes that could stare safely at his murder heart were eyes about to glaze, and even then he had to erase them after they'd looked, for fear they'd tell what they'd seen. He turned his back on the cemetery and entertained himself with plans for the future. With Boone's trial over, he'd be free to begin the mask's work afresh. He looked forward to that with a passion. He'd go farther afield from now on, find slaughtering places in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, or maybe over in Vancouver. He became hot with pleasure just thinking about it. From the briefcase he was carrying, he could almost hear Buttonface sigh through his silver teeth. Hush, he found himself telling the mask. What's that? Decker turned. Peteen was standing a yard from him. Did you say something? The cop wanted to know. He'll go to the wall, the mask said. Yes, Decker replied. I didn't hear. Just talking to myself. Peteen shrugged. Word from the chief. He says we're about to move in. Do you want to give a hand? I'm ready, the mask said. No, said Decker. Don't blame you. Are you just a head doctor? Yes. Why? Think we might need some medics before too long. They're not going to give up without a fight. I can't help. Don't even like the sight of blood. There was laughter from the briefcase, so loud Decker was certain Peteen would hear. But no. You'd better keep your distance then, he said, and turned away to head back to the field of action. Decker drew the bag up toward his chest and held it tight in his arms. From inside, he could hear the zipper opening and closing, opening and closing. Shut the fuck up, he whispered. Don't lock me away, the mask whined. Not tonight of all nights. If you don't like the sight of blood, let me look for you. I can't. You owe me, it said. You denied me in Midian, remember? I had no choice. You have now. You can give me some air. You know you'd like it. I'd be seen. Soon, then. Decker didn't reply. Soon, Mask yelled. Hush. Just say it. Please. Say it. Yes. Soon. Chapter 21. That Desire. 1. 2 men had been left on duty at the station to guard the prisoner in cell 5. Eigerman had given them explicit instructions. They were not on any account to unlock the cell door, whatever noises they heard from within. Nor was any outside agency, judge, doctor, or the good Lord himself, to be given access to the prisoner. And to enforce these edicts, should enforcement be necessary, Troopers Cormac and Kostenbaum had been given the keys to the arsenal and carte blanche to use extreme measures should the security of the station be in jeopardy. They weren't surprised. Sheerneck would most likely never see another prisoner so certain to find his way into the annals of atrocity as Boone. If he were to be sprung from custody, Eigerman's good name would be cursed from coast to coast. But there was more to the story than that, and both of them knew it. Though the chief had not been explicit about the condition of the prisoner, rumors had been right. The man was in some way freakish, possessed of powers that made him dangerous, even behind a locked and bolted door. Cormac was grateful then to have been left to guard the front of the station, while Kostenbaum watched the cell itself. The whole place was a fortress, every window and door sealed. Now it was simply a question of sitting it out, rifle at the ready, until the cavalry returned from Midian. It wouldn't be long. The kind of human garbage they'd be likely to find at Midian, addicts, perverts, radicals, would be rounded up in a few hours, and the convoy on its way back to relieve the sentinels. Then tomorrow there'd be a force up from Calgary to take possession of the prisoner, and things would settle back into their regular pattern. Cormac wasn't in the policing business to sit and sweat the way he was now. He was in it for the easy feeling that came on a summer night when he could drive down to the corner of South and Emmett and coerce one of the professionals to put her face in his lap for half an hour. That was what he liked the law for, not this fortress under siege shit. "Help me," somebody said. He heard the words quite clearly. The speaker, a woman, was just outside the front door. "Help me, please." The appeal was so pitiful he couldn't ignore it. Rifle cocked, he went to the door. There was no glass in it, not even a spy hole, so he couldn't see the speaker on the step, but he heard her again. First a sob, then a soft rapping, which was failing even as it came. "You'll have to go someplace else," he said. "I can't help you right now." "I'm hurt," she seemed to say, but he wasn't sure. He put his ear to the door. "Did you hear me?" he asked. "I can't help you. Go on down to the drugstore." There was not even a sob by way of reply, only the faintest of breaths. Cormac liked women, liked to play the boss man and breadwinner, even the hero, as long as it didn't cost him too much sweat. It went against the grain not to open the door to a woman begging for help. She'd sounded young and desperate. It was not his heart, thinking of her vulnerability. Checking first that Costin was sight to witness his defiance of Eigerman's orders, he whispered, "Hold on," and unbolted the door top and bottom. He only opened it and his hand darted through, its thumb slashing his face. The wound missed his eye by a centimeter, but the spurting blood turned half the world red. Semi-blind, he was thrown backward as the force on the other side of the door threw it open. He didn't let the rifle go, however. He fired, first at the woman, the shot went wide, then at her companion, who ran at him, half crouching to avoid the bullets. The second shot, though as wild as the first, brought blood. Not his target's, however. It was his own boot, and the good flesh and bone inside that was spattered across the floor. Jesus fucking Christ! In his horror, he let the rifle drop from his fingers. Knowing he'd not be able to bend and snatch it up again without losing his balance, he turned and started to hop toward the desk where his gun lay. But Silver Thumbs was already there, swallowing the bullets like vitamin pills. Denied his defenses, and knowing he could not stay vertical for more than a few seconds, he began to howl. 2. Outside Cell 5, Kostenbaum held his post. He had his orders. Whatever happened beyond the door into the station itself, he was to stand guard by the cell, defending it from any and every assault. That he was determined to do, however much Cormac yelled. Grinding out his cigarette, he drew the shutter in the cell door aside and put his eyes to the peephole. The killer had moved in the last few minutes, edging into the corner by degrees, as if hunted by a patch of weak sunlight that fell through the tiny window high above him. Now he could go no farther. He was wedged in the corner, wrapped up in himself. Movement aside, he looked much as he had all along, like wreckage, no danger to anyone. Appearances deceived, of course. Kostenbaum had been in uniform too long to be naive about that. But he knew a defeated man when he saw one. Boone didn't even look up when Cormac let out another yell. He just watched the crawling sunlight from the corner of his eye and shook. Kostenbaum slammed the peephole shut and turned back to watch the door through which Cormac's attackers, whoever they had to come, they'd find him ready and waiting, guns blazing. He didn't have long to contemplate his last stand, as a blast blew out the lock and half the door with it, shards and smoke filling the air. He fired into the confusion, seeing somebody coming at him. The man was tossing away the rifle he'd used to blow the door, and was raising his hands, which glinted as they swept toward Kostenbaum's eyes. The trooper hesitated long enough to catch sight of his assailant's face, like something that should have been under bandages or 6 feet of earth. Then he fired. The bullet struck its target, but slowed the man not a jot, and before he could fire a second time, he was up against the wall, with a raw face inches from his. Now he saw all too clearly what glinted in the man's hands. A hook hovered an inch from the gleam of his left eye. There was another at his groin. "Which do you want to live without?" the man said. "No need," said a woman's voice, before Kostenbaum had a chance to choose between sight and sex. "Let me," Narcissus said. "Don't let him," Kostenbaum murmured. "Please, don't let him." The woman came into view now. The parts of her that showed seemed natural enough, but he wouldn't have wanted to lay bets on what she looked like under her blouse. More tits than a bitch, most likely. He was in the hands of freaks. "Where's Boone?" she said. There was no purpose in risking his balls, eye, or otherwise. They'd find the prisoner with or without his help. "Here," he said, glancing back toward cell 5. "And the keys?" "On my belt." The woman reached down and took the keys from him. "Which one?" she said. "Blue tag," he replied. "Thank you." She moved past him to the door. "Wait," Kostenbaum said. "What?" she said. "Make him let me alone." "Narcissus," she said. The hook was withdrawn from his eye, but the one at his groin remained, pricking him. "We have to be quick," Narcissus said. "I know," the woman replied. Kostenbaum heard the door swing open. He glanced round to see her stepping into the cell. As he looked back, the fist came at his face, and he dropped to the floor, with his jaw broken in 3 places. 3. Cormac had suffered the same summary blow, but he'd been already toppling when it came, and instead of knocking him solidly into unconsciousness, it had merely left him in a daze, from which he quickly shook himself. He crawled to the door and hauled himself hand over hand to his feet. Then he stumbled out into the street. The rush of homeward traffic was over, but there were still vehicles passing in both directions, and the sight of a toeless trooper hobbling into the middle of the street, arms raised, was enough to bring the flow of traffic to a squealing halt. But even as the drivers and their passengers stepped out of the trucks and cars to come to his assistance, Cormac felt the delayed shock of his self-wounding closing his system down. The words his helpers were mouthing to him.
Hey, Christopher, how you doing?
This nonsense. He
Good
thought,
to see you.
somebody had said, "I'll get a gun," but he couldn't be sure. He hoped, prayed, his lolling tongue had told them where to find the felons, but he was even less sure of that. As the ring of faces faded around him, however, he realized his seeping foot would have left a trail that would lead them back to the transgressors. Comforted, he passed out. 4. "Boone," she said. His sallow body, bared to the waist, scarred and missing a nipple, shuddered as she spoke his name. But he
Bonsoir Chris, j'espère que tu vas bien.
didn't look up at him. "Get him going, will you?" Narcissus was at the door, staring at the prisoner. "Not with you yelling, I won't," she told him. "Leave us alone for a little while, huh?" "No time for fucky-fucky. Just get out." "Okay." He raised his arms in mock surrender. "I'm going." He closed the door. It was just her and Boone now, the living and the dead. "Get up," she told him. He did nothing but shudder. "Won't you get up? We don't have that much time." "So leave me," he said. She ignored the sentiment, but not the fact that he'd broken his silence. "Talk to me," she said.
You shouldn't have come back, he said, defeat in his every word. You put yourself at risk for nothing. She hadn't expected this. Anger, maybe, that she'd left him to be captured at the Sweet Grass Inn. Suspicion, even, that she'd come here with someone from Midian. But not this mumbling.
Well, I'm not doing too
creature
bad.
slumped in a
Can't
corner
complain.
like a boxer who'd fought a dozen running fights. Where was the man he'd seen at the inn, changing the order of his very flesh from the strength she'd seen and the appetite. He scarcely seemed capable of lifting his own head, never mind meat to his lips. That was the issue. She suddenly understood. That forbidden flesh. I can still taste it, he said. There was such shame in his voice. The human he'd been was repulsed by the thing he'd become. You weren't answerable, she told him. You weren't in control of yourself. I am now, he replied. His nails dug into the muscles of his forearms, she saw, as though he were holding himself down. I'm not going to let go. I'm going to
Je ne vais pas trop mal.
wait here till they come to string me up. That won't do any good, Boone, she reminded him. Jesus, the word decayed into tears. You know everything? Yes, Narcissus told me. You're dead. So why wish a hanging on yourself? They can't kill you. They'll find a way, he said. Take off my head, blow out my brains. Don't talk like that. They have to finish me, Laurie. Put me out of my misery. I don't want you out of your misery, she said. But I do, he replied, looking up at her for the first time. Seeing his face, she remembered how many had doted on him and understood why. Pain could have no more persuasive apologists than his bones, his eyes. I want out, he said, out of this body, out of this life. You can't. Midian needs you. It's being destroyed, Boone. Let it go. Let it all go. Midian's just a hole in the ground, full of things that should lie down and be dead. They know that, all of them. They just haven't got the balls to do what's right. Nothing's right, she found herself saying. How far she'd come to this bleak relativity. Accept what you feel and know. His small fury had faded. The sadness that replaced it was more profound than ever. I feel.
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call it into his life for tonight. I'm actually a little tired. Well, I thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone continue to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all.
Je vais mettre fin à ce live. Je tiens à remercier tout le monde d'être passé. Je vous apprécie tous.
Until next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.